Yeah, feel this from the bottom of my heart, y'all. Truly inspired. Here we go. Come on, look, yo, just teaching to the test. Forced by the feds, or they losing that check. Too many children left behind by this corporate assembly line. How they privatize education is a human right, and they kids gonna be fine. They sent them to private schools, while ours get sent to prison or given a job serving fast food. Cash rules, so it gets.
Join us on a journey that spans over 500 years as Flashpoints examines the past, present, and future of public education through a social justice lens. We'll ask brilliant minds of all ages the hard questions you won't hear on corporate media. We'll challenge ourselves to reconsider everything we think we know about teaching and learning and schooling. We'll try to imagine the unimaginable, a truly liberating educational system. And we'll connect with visionaries around the country struggling to make social justice a reality. We launch our series with the first of several programs on the history of public education. Today's show is entitled Education Before the Colonizers. To fully understand the present, we must know the past. No Child Left Behind became education law in 2001, and the battle was on for the future of public education in the 21st century. George W. Bush and his army of wealthy benefactors, lobbyists, think tanks, and media pundits had fired the opening salvo of the new millennium. But competing educational values and approaches have been clashing over many generations, ever since the European colonizers invaded the indigenous peoples of this continent and established their schools on this land we now call North America. To help explain indigenous worldviews and learning processes, we're excited and we're honored to speak with Dr. Leroy Littlebear. He is Professor Emeritus of Native Studies at the University of Lethbridge in Canada, where he was Department Chair for 25 years. He is also the former Director of the American Indian Program at Harvard University, and he has been a legal and constitutional advisor to the Assembly of First Nations. I caught up with Leroy Littlebear at his home in Alberta, Canada. We join him now as he shares more about his background.
I grew up as a Blackfoot Indian, a member of the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot Confederacy, in fact, straddles the American-Canada border. And so I grew up speaking my language. I grew up on the reservation and spent most of my time now, my adult years, in the area of higher education.
When dominant culture talks about the history of public education in the United States, the conversation often begins with the establishment of the first schools by European settlers and their descendants. Can you take us on a more honest historical journey? How did indigenous cultures think about education before the arrival of European colonizers, slave traders, and settlers?
What is education? Education is basically the handing down of the collective knowledge of a particular society to the youth, to the newborn, to the younger generation. And this is done so that the younger people, when they grow up, will end up carrying on the traditions, the customs, the beliefs, and so on. Every society, we can say, has a culture, and I prefer to refer to culture as a collective agreement. Every culture or collective agreement consists of a philosophy or paradigms. So, what is the philosophy or paradigms of Native Americans? Okay, well, it consists of several aspects. The first aspect is the Native mind revolves around what we call constant flux, constant motion. Now, for comparison purposes, in Western thought, the world is static and it's fixed. And probably the best example of that is the notion that Einstein came up with: God does not play dice with the universe. This is the way it is. Whereas in the native world, it's always movement. And it's similar to quantum physics. Quantum physics talks about constant motion. Okay? The next aspect of the native paradigm is everything is animate. Everything is full of life. So in Blackfoot thought, let's say, hey, even those rocks are alive, and I can relate to them as such. Another aspect of native thought is that everything is related, whereas in Western thought we approach things by isolating things. The next part of it is that everything, needs to be renewed. We need to renew those conditions that make for our continuing existence. Those paradigms make for a totally different way of looking at reality. So, Westerners approach education from a non-renewal basis. So in other words, if you're in grade 1 and you've done grade 1, okay, now we're in grade 3, let's say, and then you forget how to do a particular math problem or something, the teacher says to you, oh, you should have known that. We taught you that in grade 2, in grade 1. In other words, been there, done, did it. In native thought, coming back to the notion of renewal, knowledge has to be renewed all the time. It's like love. Love has to be renewed all the time. And so that's one aspect of the public education system. Hey, been there, done, did it. Let's move on. Whereas native people's approach would be, hey, we have to renew this. We have to tell the stories over again. We have to do the same ceremony. That's why, we do the same ceremonies year in and year out. We tell the same stories. We sing the same songs. That's part of renewal. See, and that's non-existent or almost non-existent in the present education system.
Wow.
See the picture?
I do. Now, were there also differences in how these cultures viewed the role of relationships in learning?
Yeah. Well, in the native world, everything is related. So, for instance, we have large relational networks. When our elders and our ceremonialists are praying, they always refer to all my relations, all our relations. And when they're talking about all our relations, they're not talking about humans. They're talking about those birds out there. They're talking about those trees out there. They're talking about the water, the fish, and so on, the stars, the sun. Those are all our relations because it is this particular combination of factors that all come together that make for our existence. Whereas in Western thought, well, all you have to do is go back to Genesis and the biblical stories where God made man, and everything else was made for the benefit of man. See, in the native worldview, hey, we're only a small part of the totality. Whereas in the Western approach, hey, we're the bosses. And that makes for a very different type of relationships. In Western thought, it manifests itself in a very hierarchical way, and the guy up on top is the ultimate boss. Whereas in the native worldview, this manifests in kind of like equality. Native Americans are always associated with the circle and everybody has to say their piece and so on. When we reach a consensus, okay, this is the way it's going to go.
I want to tie that idea to educational systems. If we were to extend that, for example, in the traditional Western paradigm of education, the teacher is the holder of all of the knowledge, basically. The students don't know anything and their heads are being passively filled. They're not the authorities. So in the indigenous views, who is it that holds the knowledge and who is it that renews the knowledge?
In the native approach, it's really about lived experience. And so there's a deference given to what is normally referred to as elders, because they've lived long and they've had a whole bunch of experiences. And when they're teaching, or, when they start to, teachings of the elders, they never come down and say, this is the way it is. What they'll always tell you is, this is how I've experienced this. Here's my experience, and they'll tell you the story. That's what they relate, is the actual lived experience.
Were there formal educational institutions at that time, like public schools or colleges?
Probably the closest that would be similar would be during the winter, for instance, is when usually the grandmas, the grandpas, in other words, the elders, would get younger people and they would tell them stories. And in each of these stories, whether they're trickster stories about coyote and so forth, about raven and so forth, they would tell them these stories. And then they would relate to them the meaning and the lessons being taught. That would probably be the closest in terms of a formal type education. But a large part of it is also mentoring the older people, the grandmas, the grandpas, and uncles, older people, relatives, and so on, would take younger people with them, whether one by one or as a group, and say, hey, let's go out and hunt. But in the process, it's not just running the deer down. It's not just running the game down, but they learn about all the topography of the land, the plants, and so on. What is it that these animals like to eat and so forth? This is where they're going to hang out and so forth. They learn all about that in the process of hunting. So it's by actual lived experience. It's by actual doing.
We're going to leave it there for today with a lot to reflect on. What could education look like if it was not rigidly confined by the walls and routines of a school, if the world was our classroom? What if the curriculum was grounded in the shared experiences of our daily lives and the collective wisdom of our diverse cultures, rather than the mandates of the education scripters, the testers, and the corporatizers trying to make a profit? What if learning was driven by our connection to each other, to our families, our communities, and to all our relations, rather than an endless race to the top, a brutal competition for the highest grades, best test scores, and most lucrative jobs, a painful sorting of winners from losers that continuously reinforces dominant power by race, class, and gender? Many appreciations to Dr. Leroy Little Bear for sharing his insights and inspiration with us today. He is Professor Emeritus of Native Studies at the University of Lethbridge in Canada, where he was Department Chair for 25 years, and he is the former Director of the American Indian Program at Harvard University. Check out the Flashpoints website at flashpoints.net, where we'll be posting the full version of our interview with Leroy Little Bear, along with all the programs in this series. On our next program, we'll pick up the conversation with the arrival of the European colonizers. Then we'll begin deconstructing the complex history of the U.S. public education system through a social justice lens. For Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio, I'm Ken Yale. The executive producer of Flashpoints is Dennis Bernstein. Technical director is Mike Biggs.